I'm going to say in advance that this video may be a little bit longer because there is a lot of important things that I want to cover, so bear with me. Um, just over a week ago, a British boxer died in the ring, Scott Westgarth. He was 31 and from Prudhoe in Northumberland, which isn't too far from where I live. And he was a light heavyweight. And after winning a bout with Dick Spellman in Doncaster, he um, he collapsed, was brought to hospital, although apparently he was conscious and speaking in the ambulance, but he died later on. Now, the passing of Scott Westgarth is the third British fighter to die in the ring in as many years. There was Mike Tyle of Glasgow back in 2016. Then later that year, Kuba Moshik in Great Yarmouth. He was only 22, and now the death of Scott Westgarth. That's three fighters who've died in as many years. I should say the Moshik incident was a bit different from the others because it was a non-licensed event. As I understand, the bouts that Mike Tyle and Scott Westgarth were involved in were both sanctioned by the British Boxing Board of Control, so there is a bit of a difference. In fact, I've just read a report that Great Yarmouth Council has now brought in new rules regarding boxing in the district. Um, Norfolk senior coroner, I'm just reading from a BBC report here, Jacqueline Lake expressed concerns about medical care, saying that not all boxers at the event, including Mr. Moshik's opponent, received full medical checks before fighting. Um, Now, I've been in an event that was technically unlicensed. It was white collar boxing. I know in our case we had to go through medical. Uh, well, I can't say it was full medical checks, but we did have checks before the bout. Um, I suppose on the surface they were quite basic checks. They checked our pulse, particularly with older guys who were in their 40s and 50s. They checked the pulse and things like this, asked how we were feeling, and there were definitely paramedics on standby. It is important to say that unlicensed events in the UK are not legal. Sometimes I think people hear on license and they think it's kind of like gangsters in sort of car parks and things like that. It's not like that. This was mainstream insofar as it was open to the public and it was they took those things into consideration. Um, and the referee in my case was very professional. I We had to wear headgear and I couldn't. My opponent was hitting after the bell, and he stepped in there. I lost the bout because I wasn't sufficiently defending myself. Um, but I know had that referee not been professional, my opponent maybe could have done me serious damage. And that's something that have to bear in mind. I'll come back to my example in a little bit, but firstly, a brief kind of history of the issues around safety in the sport. Um, Boxing has always been controversial. Boxing has always had something of a taboo. In the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, shortly after Queen Victoria and Prince Albert came to the throne, um, the whole idea of Victorian morality meant that the new monarch uh, saw the blood sport of bare knuckle boxing as detrimental to the ideals of Victorian society. So it was outlawed, but that never stopped it happening. There was still plenty of bare knuckle fights in rural Cambridgeshire and in rural England, and very often it was a case of local magistrates being paid off. This is seen in the film Gangs of New York, which is set in the 1860s, where Leonardo DiCaprio's character um, kind of exposes the corruption because his character says, well, where does the city limits end when the police chief tries to break up a bare knuckle contest? And so he basically stages it so that the fight will continue, but just outside the city limits, things like that. So there's always been a corrupt element to the sport. And that's something that can't be overlooked. And in fact, that is very important when the question of banning boxing comes in. as far as I know, there's only been one Western democracy that has outright banned gloved boxing, and that was Sweden. Um, but I'm not sure if that's still the case. Um, I don't know. I'm not quite sure what the situation with boxing is in Sweden today, but I know for a long time it was banned in that country. So I guess we'd have to look at the what happened in Sweden. Did it go underground? Was that the case? I don't know, but I do know that in Britain, definitely we've always had a boxing scene in some form or another. The modern sport of boxing is traced to this country. In fact, the first contest is traced back to 1684. I'm not talking about ancient boxing in the classical world, Pancration, I think it was called, in the ancient Olympics. I'm talking about boxing in the modern world. It has its origins in Great Britain and it gradually developed from the 1680s onwards through various codes of conduct, James Figg's rules, and then the better known Marquess of Queensberry rules, which were drafted in 1867. And then in the 20th century, there was evolutionary changes as well. In the 1980s, I believe it was 1987, championship fights were brought down from 15 rounds to 12 rounds. I think that was partly in response to the death of Kim Duk-Koo, a South Korean fighter, in following his bout with Ray Mancini. 2 years before that, Welsh fighter Johnny Owen died in a fight with Lupe Pintor. There's a statue in his hometown of Merthyr Tydfil honouring him. Um, I think obviously it's very difficult for the family of a fallen fighter, first and foremost, but it's also very difficult for the opponent because inevitably they're human beings, they go through all sorts of guilt. I know that Lupe Pintor faced that. Johnny Owen's family actually encouraged him to continue boxing. They didn't want him to feel guilty. Technically, he caused their son's death, but they understood that Johnny Owen was a fighter. And every fighter who enters the ring knows that there is risks involved. And if they don't, then they shouldn't be in the ring. But I don't want that to sound crude or insensitive. Um, there are a lot of things that need to be raised. There tends to be a sort of protocol when a fighter dies. It tends to be the boxing fraternity sort of says how sad it is, and we think of his family. And sometimes there's donations come in. People are very generous. I know that's happening for Scott Westgarth's family, and everyone expresses their condolences. But then it's kind of back to normal. That is something that maybe needs to be looked at. It's like any problem. It's not good enough just saying, "Oh, it's bad," but let's just say how sad it is and then move on. And I think, if we're being brutally honest, there is an aspect of the boxing world that kind of wants to ignore these things and pretend that it isn't a, or at least they'll express condolences, but then it'll sort of be like, oh well, you know. And I think there is that aspect among fans as well. Fans can be very fickle. Now, I'm not saying that people offering condolences is insincere. I believe they are sincere. But what bugs me is people will offer condolences, then a week later they go to another fight, or a month later, and they're yelling for a fighter to finish someone off. So I'm going to approach this with a few different angles. First of all, the question of banning it or not, and then what the boxing world can do to improve the situation, and um, and finally the philosophy around this sport. Because I'm not trying to sort of convince critics that they're wrong, but I do think it's important that they're open minded, because I think critics have this view of boxing's barbaric, boxers are idiots, and that's it. And it's a very reductionist and lazy way to dismiss this. So I'm going to approach it in those three stages. Firstly, ban boxing. Well, came across a debate recently on Good Morning Britain. Piers Morgan, Susanna Reid, Miriam Stoppard, and Chris Eubank Sr. Now, Chris Eubank Sr. and Piers Morgan were against the idea of banning boxing. In the case of Piers Morgan, he's a boxing fan. He's covered fights in his career as a journalist, And in the case of Chris Eubank Senior, well, that's hardly surprising. He's um, one of Britain's greatest ever fighters. He's household name. Um, and of course, his son is one of the most prominent fighters around at the moment. So you would expect him to take that position. Susanna Reid, her opinion was she was sympathetic to the views of Miriam Stoppard. Miriam Stoppard is a registered doctor. I don't know exactly what her background is, but she is of the view that it should be banned. It was a very civil debate. There was no raised voices or anything like that. But I was listening to Miriam Stoppard because I want to be open minded. I want to hear what the other side says, and she made some valid points. But Chris Eubank also made valid points, and basically it was along these lines. Miriam Stoppard made the point that in the sport of boxing there is an intention to stun your opponent, and it is unique even among martial arts of a focus on the head. Now, any boxer that is being brutally honest will say clearly it's not healthy to be hit repeatedly on the head. The human brain is not designed for that. And there isn't really any way to argue against that. But Chris Eubank also made the point why the focus on boxing when other sports have a risk factor. Now, you could argue that show jumping, gymnastics, cheerleading, rugby don't have an intention of hurting your opponent. Well, I don't know about rugby, but boxing actually ranks somewhere around the middle. If you look at all sports, boxing actually ranks somewhere around the middle in terms of injuries. So it's far lower, believe it or not, than cheerleading in terms of injuries. I mean, look at this new film, I Tonya, that was about, maybe it's not a good example because it was almost a freak incident, but that was about an ice skater, for goodness sake, who got brutally attacked. Although I suppose you could say that was outside the sport, but there does seem to be a moral judgment of boxing that isn't put onto other sports, and I'm not sure if that is right. Because for one thing, it takes away the self-determination agency. That is, that fighters go into the ring because they want to be in there. I saw Scott Westgarth's interview just after the bout. People were saying he looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure about that. I didn't really notice that. Maybe he did. I'd have to see it again. But he said, I'm not going to be a world champion, I know that, but I just want to entertain the fans. This was a young man who clearly loved what he was doing. And that's clear from his body language. He did not look like someone who did not want to be there. Now, I concede there have been examples where fighters have been maybe pressured by a corrupt I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the mafia controlled boxing. No doubt there was fighters who were coerced to take falls, to do all sorts of things, and that is disgusting. So the sport of boxing, like every other business that involves big money, has to be very wary of that. I'm not sure if you can ever totally get rid of organized crime aspects, but you can at least tackle it. I mean, if I was a promoter, I would be very hard line in who's involved in terms of how fighters are treated and in terms of what happens. Promoters are, of course, first and foremost businessmen, which is why I think promoters who have been fighters, people like Oscar de la Hoya, are probably the best type of promoters because they have an empathy with fighters in a way that other promoters would not necessarily have. Um, so that was the debate. Here's the thing: if you ban boxing, it will go underground, and that, far from helping fighters, will put them at more risk. Now, you could argue, oh, but if they're choosing to get involved with criminal fraternities, then they're asking for it. That may be a valid argument, but here's my question. At the moment, the UK has roughly 1,000 licensed professional boxers. Now, let's say boxing's made illegal tomorrow or a month from now. It isn't going to happen, but let's say it did. What happens to those guys and women who have professional licenses? Where do they go? Are they supposed to just give up their careers, their ambitions, their goals, their dreams, things they've worked really hard at for hours and hours in the gym? Are they supposed to just say, "Oh well, it's illegal now, and if I continue, I'm breaking the law"? you're criminalizing people who in most cases are not criminals. Um, that is something I think would be problematic. If it goes underground, you also take away all the regulations that are in place. There'd be no ringside paramedics. There would be very dubious referees, if any. Um, it would make the situation, in my opinion, far more um, far more potentially dangerous. And it's a world that can be very dark and very gritty. Boxing is never ever going to be without a degree of controversy. It is a martial art. It involves physical aggression. Um, Now, when Chris Eubank said it's beautiful, I can understand critics questioning that. I'm not sure if I would describe that. However, Piers Morgan said artists are like, excuse me, boxers are like artists. What people need to understand is boxing is different from a street fight. It really is. You look at two guys that get drunk, have a fist fight outside a pub. One staggers back, hits her head on a passing vehicle. Now, there is always going to be risk in a boxing ring, but there is a degree there of control, self-control, of discipline, of respecting your opponent that you would not get in a street fight. Which incidentally is why I'm very wary of street fights. You see them all over the internet, sometimes very young people involved as well. Makes me very uncomfortable because there is no regulations, there is no control. It looks like they've organized it among themselves. That is reckless. In a boxing match, even an amateur fight, you have control. You do. Okay, you may get dirty fighters who don't always respect the rules, but the point is there is a control base there. Also, in most cases, there is not malice between fighters. Yes, you get a situation sometimes where hype and where trash talking can go too far, and sometimes I think it can go too far. We get two guys that really do seem to hate each other. That concerns me because then you think there will be malice involved. Um, and sometimes the boxing world promotes it, maybe more than they should. We always have to remember that hype should be for hype's sake, not for genuinely getting two guys to kill each other, because then you have a situation where it turns from a sport that involves aggression to basically the modern equivalent of gladiators. And it isn't the first time that analogy's been made. I remember seeing old British Pathé videos of fighters in the 1940s entering British rings, and old BBC commentators, and the gladiators enter the ring. And it sounds silly, but when you think about it, two men facing each other, stripped to the waist, in front of sometimes tens of thousands of people, it really is the nearest equivalent. Um, so, banning the sport, I don't think is an option. So, what can be done? I think there needs to be much more responsibility from fans, and this might be a controversial point, but I think it needs to be said. I think at present there is too much pressure on referees and to a lesser extent judges. If you have a really good action-packed fight, in other words, a fan favorite type fight, referees are going to be very reluctant to stop it because they feel that they are going to be booed and heckled and jeered. You need tough skin to be a referee. They're not called the third man in the ring for nothing. But I think as fans, we need to be more respectful of the fact that they're in a unique position that someone sitting 100 meters from the ring wouldn't necessarily be. The referee is closer to anyone, to the fighters. I remember when Howard Foster stopped the first Groves Frotch fight, he got a lot of abuse for that. I made a video at the time defending him because I felt that he'd made the right call. Groves was fighting bravely, but his legs were gone, I think. Um, and I say it's better to stop a fight early than stop it too late. Stop a fight early and be unpopular. Stop a fight late, and a young man could be brain damaged for the rest of his life. So that's a choice a referee faces. New technology is coming into fore. For example, I've seen in the States I have these little cameras inserted into like a bandana. I think that's a good idea. I think there's things that can be done. Um, but I think there has to be an attitude change among fans as well. we have to remember that fighters, it doesn't matter if you're a first time amateur fighter or you're Floyd Mayweather Jr., all fighters are human beings. Doesn't matter how outstanding they are, even the greatest fighters will start to slow down. They will start to not be their best. So that's very important because when you get fighters calling for, excuse me, when you get fans who put so much judgment on a fighter, let's say a fighter retires, then you get all this trash talking from fans. Oh, it's because he's scared of this guy or that guy. Um, Inevitably, there's a huge amount of ego involved in the sport. And because it is a hierarchy, because it is competitive, that's unavoidable. Of course, there's going to be debate over who should fight this guy, who should fight that guy, which sort of matchups work, and so on. That's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it has to come with a caveat of knowing that when you're demanding a fighter go into that situation, you have to remember they're taking risks every time they enter a ring. So it makes me very angry when fans, so called fans, disrespect fighters. And they call guys bums or cards or whatever. I remember the time Andrew Galotta left the ring in his fight with Mike Tyson, and it was controversial at the time because this was very strange. Galotta's a tough man, you know. He's not like, well, anyone who enters the ring is, you have to have courage as a prerequisite, but especially someone like Andrew Galotta, a warrior who'd been through many tough fights, and he was, you know, fan threw things at him. It was a very ugly scene. It turns out that he felt he'd had some sort of permanent damage, and that did transpire to be true. So maybe there needs to be a much greater focus on medical checks before fights as absolutely mandatory. And fora, maybe that needs to be explored to be advanced. But even with that, you know, a guy could be 100% physically fit, um, and you know he could suffer a bad shot in the fight, then it would be over. I think some things have improved since the Michael Watson incident in 1990, which Chris Eubank was involved in. On that occasion, paramedics were not at ringside. Now that has changed in sanctioned fights. Um, in the off-license scene, on-license scene, maybe they need to improve their minimum safety standards. But then there's a lot of issues involved in that in terms of where do you get the paramedics or the doctor from. So there is a lot of questions. None of this is black and white. But I do think a change in the fans' mentality is very important because we put the pressure on fighters. And, you know, when a guy quits, let's say it's been a tough 8 round war, and a guy physically cannot take any more, who are fans to judge him? Who are fans to judge him? He's the one in there who's going through the pain, who's going through, nobody knows themselves better than themselves. So I think fans need to respect that at times fighters do have enough. And that doesn't make them a card, it doesn't mean that they're automatically a bad fighter. So certain mentalities like that I think need to change. Even great fighters have ended their career on the stool, which is a sad way to go out, but it's happened. Um, so I really think there has to be a fundamental change in the attitude of fans because it seems profoundly hypocritical to express condolences and say how awful it is. Then people just go straight back to calling fans all the names under the sun, calling fighters all the names under the sun. So, as an absolute prerequisite, respect all fighters. I'm not saying like all fighters personally, but respect what they are doing. That's something that needs to be, I think, far more promoted. Can't say forced, you can't do that, but promoted at least. Um, I have no respect for fans who badmouth fighters when they would never do it themselves, or badmouth referees for that matter. Referees need to be respected. They're in a very, very difficult job. And yes, sometimes they make mistakes, but it's better to stop it early, and maybe they didn't need to, and therefore risk on popularity, versus stopping it too late. And commentators, I think, need to be careful when they're when they're criticizing referees in that regard. It goes the other way when referees let a fight go on too long and the fans acknowledge that it should have been ended early. So I'm not just blaming fans. This is about collective responsibility. Fighters have responsibility when they're when in the way they talk about other fighters, which is why the sort of respect shown by Joshua and Klitschko is something to be heralded. The truth is, there are no easy answers. Boxing is always going to be risky. But this is where I'm going to get into the philosophy of it. If, critics of boxing don't understand it, they say it's savage, it's two guys battering the hell out of each other, people are paying money to watch it. I understand on the surface that's how it looks. But firstly, you have to differentiate between a boxing match and a street fight. That's first thing. Secondly, there is that free choice element. It's true that in many parts of the world, poverty forces young men into boxing. In Colombia, in Mexico, indeed in parts of Britain and the United States. That is true. But Chris Eubank made a valid point, which is that in many cases, the alternative is a life in gang culture. It's a life of crime. It's a life of probably ended up getting shot at 21. So contrast that with the potential of distinguishing yourself in the sport. Now, of course, most fighters will not become champions. Most fighters will not even be well known. But as Scott Westgarth said, he knew that. And I think most fighters do. And it also reminds us of why we have to respect so called journeymen, those guys who know that they're never going to get big fights, but they're absolutely necessary to the sport. When professional fighters dismiss journeymen, that's doing a disservice to what these guys do. You can't have the sport of boxing without them. Um, but the mentality that people need to understand is that a fighter wants to push himself. He wants to test himself. Why did I do it? Why did I go into the ring? I knew there was a real chance I could get seriously hurt. I knew that. And I'm sure my opponent knew it as well. But I wanted to test my courage in a way that something like tennis would not offer. And okay, you could say there's other sports that would test courage. Maybe, watching the Olympics recently, certainly the luge looks like it takes some guts. But there's something about facing another man in front of a crowd in that sort of way is very appealing. It is. And unless you follow the sport or you've been in the ring, you can't really understand it. And I'm sure all three men, Mike Tile, uh, Cooper Moshik, and Scott Westgarth, those three guys knew this. They would have had that mentality. I'm doing this because I want to do it. That's not to say there aren't fighters, like I say, in the case of Andrew Galotta and some others who at times do want to quit. I think the sport should allow them. There's also that aspect we shouldn't say we shouldn't question a fighter's judgment about themselves. When a guy thinks he's had enough, when he really believes that, he should be given the freedom to get out of it. Because boxers are not slaves. They should not be forced to fight if their heart is no longer in it. And that's something that we really need to also respect. Um, I'm going to have to round this up soon. It's been a long video, but there was a lot that I want to cover. As a boxing fan, I find it so depressing every time I hear something like this. And 3 deaths in 3 years, this has been a particularly bad period. Ironically, at a time when British boxing is doing well in terms of skill and in terms of very action-packed fights we've seen. But um, people need to understand the mentality that boxers have and people who go into the ring. So, yes, it's tragic what happened to Scott Westgarth, but you could also look at it as he could be a lonely old man who died on his own. Instead, he died doing something he loved. One thing that I actually concerns me more than a boxer's death, this might sound strange, is a boxer being permanently injured. Edward Guteknik and Nick Blackwell, for instance. In the case of Guteknik, like I say, the psychology involved. George Groves was interviewed about that, and you could tell any man who's been involved in a fight where their opponent has went through that, they wouldn't be human if they didn't feel guilt and they didn't feel if it wasn't mentally very trying for them. The great Rocky Marciano went through it. One of his opponents died early on, and in the fights after that, apparently Marciano was reluctant to finish off an opponent. So people shouldn't assume that boxers are callous brutes who don't have any compassion for their opponent. They primarily want to win the fight. There's very, very few fighters out there who genuinely want to hurt their opponent to that extent. Very, very few. Um, it's far more a battle against themselves than against their opponent. It's pushing themselves to that boundary and thinking, can I do this? And that's something that people need to respect. In a free society, people should have the right to make their own choices and their own mistakes. I'm going to have to leave it there because this has been very long, but I hope I've given people some things to think about, both critics of the sport and fans. As fans, we need to take more self responsibility. We're not children. We need to stop demanding that fighters, you know, push themselves beyond their human means. We need to respect the fact a fighter has had enough when he's had enough, and so on. And I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching.